Okay, it is noon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Kayla Pfister. I'm the Communications Specialist here at Alaska Children's Trust. Today, I'm joined by Becky Judd, who will be doing a presentation on helping Alaska youth thrive, something important to everyone, all of us, and how to increase youth health and well-being. We'll be talking about risk and protective factors. So we're going to get started. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, it is recommended that you go to our Zoom link instead, because there are going to be some poll questions so you can participate. You'll find that in the description in the event. So if you'd like to join on Zoom, you can still register and join us right now. A little bit about the meeting. Please make sure that you are on mute when you are not speaking, and there will be some time to ask questions at several places throughout the slideshow. You can unmute then if you'd like to ask your question verbally, or you can write it in our chat box. I will be monitoring the chat box while Becky is presenting. There are also several polls throughout the session. They should pop up right on top of your screen, and we would love for you to participate in them because they really help us gauge where to go with the conversation and let us know a little bit more about you as we go. So again, let me know if you have any questions in the chat box, either about this presentation or about Alaska Children's Trust in general. And keep in mind that this is the first of 2 sessions. The next session will be on Thursday evening at 6 p.m. And it will kind of talk more about the implementation of some of the protective factors that we're learning today. So keep that in mind. If you haven't registered for Thursday's session, make sure you join us for session 2. A little bit about Becky, our presenter. Becky has worked with youth and systems that serve youth for over 40 years, including schools, different programs, tribal organizations, and health and social and juvenile justice services as well. And before starting at Alaska Public Health and Behavioral Health Division, she was a prevention trainer in youth alcohol and drug prevention, suicide prevention, and a youth coalition organizer. After 20 years with the state, she now volunteers and consults with organizations like Alaska Children's Trust through her business strength-based strategies. So I will turn it over to Becky. Thank you so much, Becky, for joining us.
Thanks, Kayla. And it's wonderful to see some very familiar faces. And I have to smile because some of those I'm thinking to myself, wow, you guys should be doing this presentation. So I'm going to get started here. I know we've only got an hour, and with all the polls and times for questions that Kayla just mentioned, I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but I did make some specific spaces for us to be able to, for you to be able to ask questions. So just as she said, this is part 1, helping Alaska youth thrive, increasing their health and their well-being. And just a quick overview of what we're going to cover, what I'll be covering in today's session is I want to give context, and I want to talk about upstream principles of prevention, health, and development. And then I'm going to specifically define what do we mean by youth risk and protective factors, and move to what is the national research show, as well as our own Alaska data. And we're looking specifically at the behaviors of depression and suicide, substance use, misuse, sexual activity, bullying, and violence. And then we're going to just shift slowly or quickly to the relevance to the most vulnerable youth, which are our youth who are homeless, in foster care, have experienced child abuse, pregnant, and parenting. And again, that reminder that part 2 is going to be the moving to action. In some of the other sessions I've done it all in one, but we decided we'd break this up and let you have more questions, especially those related to data. So I want to point out that there is a handout of sorts that I made available. That's a 2-page one that makes it nice and easy for you to take a look at just what's the summary of some of the main points. So let's begin. So I want to start with this concept of upstream prevention principles, just to give us some context. So what this means is that instead of an exclusive focus on the individual or the problem or its very consequences, we want to identify and address what are the influences contributing to that problem. And that's what we call risk and protective factors. In doing so, we're going to look at the social environments. We're going to look at the overlap of the behaviors and the influences. And then it's going to be a reminder to all of us, focus on what you can influence. There may be some very powerful factors that are important, but you can't address those. That's going to be somebody else's job. So I want to go to this prevention principle, the first one, going upstream, and offer some examples here for you. So if you see these rocks in the middle of the picture here, I want you to think about those as, in general, some of the youth problem behaviors. And in general, we're thinking about how are they doing in school? Are they failing in school? Are they using substances? Are they feeling alone, depressed, having suicidal ideation? Are they involved in fighting and delinquency? Are they involved in unhealthy relationships? And so I realized as soon as I got into this that, Kayla, I forgot our poll. And by now we've got enough people in here that I think we can do that poll. So I'm wondering if we could go to that. Could we do that with me keeping the screen up?
Yes, we can. So I will
Okay.
put up our first poll. Okay. So you should be able to vote. So what role are you joining this presentation as? And you may fit into multiple of these. Just pick kind of your primary role that you're joining us with. And then I'll share the results after.
And scroll down beyond health provider, because there's some in there. There's some other options. And I want to do this because, as I say, I know some of you could do this presentation, but some of you may be very new to this work. And so it's going to help me tailor this. So let's see what you've got here.
Okay, looks like we have most of the results.
All right, our partner organizations, I'm never quite sure. I know you have multiple ones. Okay. All right, let's go to the next one here. So how familiar are you with ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences? Okay. I will barely touch on it because most of you know it, but for the few that aren't, I will make mention of it. And then the last question here is, how familiar are you with, this concept of risk and protective factors related to adolescence? Okay, great. Most of you know it. So I am going to abbreviate some of what I'm going to say. Okay. I'll make some adjustments because let's get to the data. All right. So going back to the concept of going upstream. Thanks for helping me out with that, Kayla. We can make that poll go away. There we go. Okay. So in terms of going upstream, these are some of the problem behaviors we're looking at. But if we're really going to go upstream, just a second, my screen froze a minute. We have to look at upstream of what's happening in the environment with the family, what's happening during early childhood, what's happening in middle school. So we're going to use the example of alcohol use. Often when we define and describe the problem of alcohol use among students, we often talk about it and define it by consumption. So we look at things like how many drinks did they have in the last 30 days, binge drinking, and all the types of liquor. We may look at where they got their liquor from. We may also look at the consequences. So there again are school suspensions, car crashes, hospitalizations, or deaths. So this is how when we're doing prevention, the problem is described. But what we know from prevention science now is that we've got to go, as I said before, upstream. So what was happening in the family's life, in the parents' life before they even had their child? What what are the resources? What are the educational level of the parents? What resources do the parents have themselves? What kind of access do they have to childcare? Do they have the supports that they need? And then what's happening in that child's life when they're young? Are they having adverse experiences or positive experiences? And again, what's happening in middle school and high school? What are the kinds of things that might be affecting how young people are dealing with the challenges before them? That's where real prevention begins, is between the grades of kindergarten through 5th grade. So we're not dealing with these challenges down here so much. So the second principle is that individuals are shaped by their environments. In the old days, the focus was always on the individual. If only they had the right information, if only they knew the information, then they would make the right decision. But what we know now is that we have to be looking at relationships. And we've always known parents had a powerful impact. But we also know that peers do as well, and other adults can. And then within the community, we've seen the power of schools and youth programs. And as well as among healthcare providers, what is the relationship that you have when you have your clients come in? And lastly, and very importantly, is this whole cultural societal context. All of these have an interplay with risk and protective factors. The third principle is this overlap of problem behaviors for some youth, not all youth, but some. And I'm going to make this point right now by talking about some Alaska data that we have. It comes from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And I'm going to make an assumption, given what you've already told me through your poll, that most of you know about it. So the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, for those of you that don't, it's an anonymous self-report survey of high school students, and it requires parent consent to participate. It's conducted every 2 years by the Department of Health and the Department of Early Childhood and Development. Now, there's 6 main areas of health questions. You can see them there on the screen. And in 2003, we began asking about protective factors. What we get is school districts, schools, and students, they're all selected through a randomized process, and it creates what we call a representative sample. So we have a representative sample for the statewide traditional high schools. We have ones for alternative high schools, and those are schools, high schools, alternative high schools are ones where for students who have not been successful in their traditional public school setting. Alternative schools are also public, but again, they're for students who haven't done well, and they're very much at risk of dropping out. In general, those are schools that are making sure to be serving students who may be homeless. They may have untreated mental health issues, as well as substance use issues, social anxiety, teen parents, and so forth. The last sample is local districts. If they have a large enough sample, we'll have their own. And if you're interested in knowing more about it, here is their link. But I'm going to use this data to show you and talk a little bit about this idea of the overlap of behaviors. So here's this next slide. You're seeing a pie chart. And these are what I'm calling current problem behaviors. If you look down at the bottom, they include fighting, substance use relating to tobacco, alcohol, marijuana, and other drugs, suicide ideation, failing grades, and unsafe sexual activity. In 2017, Charles Udamal and myself, we looked at what percentage of all the high school students that participated in the traditional sample were involved in one or more of these behaviors in this past year. And you'll see most youth are doing really well. They have 0 to 1 of these, okay? They had a problem they had to deal with. I didn't want you to see that yet. The next one is about a quarter of them, a little over a quarter involved 2 or more. And the bigger concern, of course, is that those that have 3 to 4 or 5 or more. So you've got about 24%. This is a big deal. This is going to have major implications for when you're thinking about the kind of services you want to have available. But here's something I want to also have you take a look at. I told you about the alternative school sample. And you look at here, you're seeing it's 61% of these students have 3 or more behaviors of concern here. 3, and you can see 27%. This is quite striking. And the question you may be asking yourself, well, what's different again between alternative students who are going to alternative schools and students who are at traditional schools? And one of those differences, and we know this by asking 3 questions on the Youth Risk Behavior Survey about their past experience with being victimized. And what we find is that, let's see if I can pull this up, among the traditional, we have 11%, twice that number for alternative. By victimized, I mean that they have experienced forced sexual activity, dating violence, or physical violence or sexual violence, sexual dating violence. And this does not get at the questions related to adverse childhood experiences other than potentially having forced sex. We can't ask other questions that have to do with families on the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. So when we look at this, this kind of gives us a little bit of a feel for, these students are different and the kinds of services and supports they need are going to be different as well. So I'm just going to open this up and ask if you've got some questions. That's why I've got that circle there. So Kayla, you can help me if there are any in the chat, otherwise somebody can unmute.
Yeah, no questions so far.
Okay, good. This is the first time we've had this kind of data and I've been able to share it with people just this last year. We've got this data nationally, but we didn't have it for our own Alaska population. So this was powerful, especially once you're looking at what do we do about it. So we're going to go back to this principle 1, this focus on risk and protective factors. And let's just make sure that we've got the same definitions here. I want to remind you again, we're talking about factors that impact all these different behaviors. And this again had to do with substance use and tobacco, violence, bullying, failing grades, and so forth. And then the individual context in relationship to the other relationships, community, and society. So with risk factors, the definition that I like to just use, pretty simple, is it's the personal characteristics, it's the external conditions or negative experiences that increase the chances of problems later. So some examples of this can be a person may have a fetal alcohol or drug exposure, or it may be that they are using alcohol or other drugs early, before the age 13. An external condition could be that they've experienced early trauma in their life. With protective factors, we're looking at, again, personal characteristics, external conditions, and positive experiences that help youth cope with challenges and prevent future problems. So those examples could be personal, having just an easygoing kind of temperament, having social emotional skills so you can develop friendships. And external could be having supportive parents and feeling connected to their school. So I like this graphic just because it kind of shows, hey, this is life, all right? And risk factors, they increase the chances of problems like the ones we just talked about. Protective factors help us manage and cope with the crisis and challenges in life. And they also lead to healthy development and thriving, not just surviving problems. So I want to take a moment here and have you step back, and I'd like us to think about what are some of the positive outcomes, not just the negative outcomes. We already know what the negative outcomes are, but what are the positive outcomes, the things that you hope for your children? And if you can just type those in the chat box for a moment, then I want us to keep a focus and a reminder of why we are focusing on protective factors.
So far, Becky, we have good mental health, healthy coping skills, meaningful work, sense of connectedness and community, self-efficacy, and good mental health.
Okay.
a happy family.
Yeah, thinking ahead there. Relationships,
Strong
strong community ties.
ties.
I'm seeing them now. Yep. Coping skills. Yep. Giving back to the community. Sure. Well, when I had done this workshop before, thanks everyone. Here's some of the ideas that people had come up with before, and you'll see that they're pretty similar. All right, now what I want for my kids, I want them to have positive, healthy friends. And I want their relationships, their dating relationships, to be respectful. And then there are others that have said, well, I want my daughter to be able to develop a sense of who she is, or develop what her possibilities are, what her talents are. For others are saying, you know, bottom line, I want them to graduate from high school, or I want them to make sure that they're getting good grades so that they can graduate from high school. Later on, I want them to be able to have job skills training. I want them to go on to higher education, and then looking to the future of getting a job or being able to support your family, helping, being just a helpful neighbor, an engaged citizen. Someone else said a family member, a loving parent. Others, according to culture, you know, there may be some other ones. It might be being a person that can fix anything, or it could be someone that is a good hunter. But I mention this because I want us to make sure that we focus not just on preventing problems, but what are the positive outcomes that we're looking for. So as we switch to what risk and protective factors are most important, we're now switching to this, what does the research show us? Okay, and this is national research that I've been a part of with many of my colleagues over the years, and maintaining a literature review of looking at these 4 topic areas: the depression and suicide, the mental health areas, substance use, violence, and unsafe sexual activity. And you can see the specific activities, or I'm sorry, areas here. And in our literature review, if we were going to include that factor, it had to have an influence on at least 2 of these behaviors, at least 2, and it had to be cited in a peer-reviewed journal, a university study, or some federal or state reports. If you're interested in this literature review, you'll see the link down there below, and I have it in the resource section, and it's also on the Children's Trust website. So you have, in the handout that I've shared with you, you've got all the ones that we came up with, and you're going to see that there's close to 50 of them. And we got a pushback from the state epidemiological outcomes work group when I was working for behavioral health. And they said, Becky, this is way too many. We all agreed. They said, we've got to have priority factors for Alaska. So we came up with the criteria, and here it is. It had to be based on solid research, that our top factors, and these were supposed to be in the air, like the top 10, what was most relevant for Alaska, what was changeable at the community level. And that's really key. Poverty is a major risk factor, and yet is it changeable at the community level? If it's not, it didn't make the priority list, even though it is so powerful. And the last is sufficient public will and interest, and here we're really talking about readiness. So what are those factors? And I'm going to, because most of you know of these, I'm going to go through these just as fast as I can, but I know that some of you aren't as familiar. So when we talk about early onset, we're talking about generally under the age of 13 with exposure to alcohol and other drugs. If you have under 13, it's one of the strongest predictors for escalating frequent use in adolescence, as well as young adult misuse and problems later. Feeling alone and depressed is certainly one of those indicators related to being lonely. The social isolation that we may be seeing now because of COVID, it's increased young people who feel this way. We've seen are at increased risk for substance use, sexual behaviors, problems at school, problems with peers and family. Loss of cultural identity. What we're talking about here, first of all, when we talk about cultural identity, it's that feeling that you belong to a group of people who are like you. It can be related to nationality, to ethnicity, religion, age, ability, or any kind of social group that has its own specific distinct culture. This loss of cultural identity can emerge from migration, oppression, colonization, or forced assimilation. And as we know in Alaska, our Alaska Native people, American Indians, have experienced high levels of psychological and social stress due in part to historical trauma and intergenerational trauma. And these adverse effects are associated with suicide and high rates of substance use. The family history of problems and the child abuse and neglect is where the adverse childhood experiences emerge from. Family history of problems, generally we're talking about violence, alcohol and drug addiction, early criminal activity. Child abuse, we're looking here at emotional, physical, sexual. Neglect is emotional, physical. You also are looking at household dysfunction, which also gets at number 4. And we're also looking at families that may have problems with mental health issues. And the last here is unhealthy community laws, norms, and beliefs. And what we mean by that is, and I'm having to read from the definitions that come from our literature search here, is we're talking about examples of, it's the number of liquor or marijuana licenses in a community. It could be the location and hours of the stores, of the alcohol or marijuana stores. It may involve impaired driving laws. Informally, we could be looking at norms, expectations, and social practices by parents, community members, or teachers that create kind of a climate of acceptance or tolerance for behavior that's unhealthy, like hosting underage drinking parties, or a belief that boys will just be boys when they get into trouble, or drinking and driving is okay. So what happens with these risk factors on the behaviors that we were concerned about? So our literature review that we did, here are the 4 areas of major concern. These are the risk behaviors I just described. And you can see if there's a check mark, that means that there has been in the literature, in the research, it showed a significant impact. You can see the one that had the most has to do here with family. These are the adverse childhood experiences. These little arrows here are reminding us, especially if I don't, I've got a sensitive touchpad. What happens in family affects the individual. What happens in community affects the individual. So I stop and pause a moment just to make sure if anyone has any questions about this, I can answer those. You can write them in the chat.
Becky, this is Margot.
Hi, Margot.
What is an example of an unhealthy community law, norm, or belief?
Okay. Well, I may have run through that a little quickly, so I'm gonna.
I got a couple of ideas, but I just want to be sure where.
Yeah. Yeah. So an example of a law might be it's related to how many alcohol licenses are there in a community, and where are those licenses? How close are they to a school, for example, right? Now, in smaller communities, this is more challenging because, of course, of the density, or how, where services are related to schools or stores. Other examples can be the impaired driving laws. What happens? And then there is of course, how is it enforced? And that gets us.
Becky, I'm sorry to interrupt. Something has changed with your audio. Did you change anything?
No.
Was it maybe papers moving around? It was just, there was something over it.
Okay, how's my volume now?
You're good now. Yeah, you're good now, actually.
Okay, all right.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, I'm glad you did. Margot, let's stop with, does that answer your question?
It does. It's what I was thinking of that, the same way. I just wanted to make sure I was on the same Thinking
Same page?
about it's the same page, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You know, again, I've got some more examples of this in the literature review. A few others I'll just give some, like a local practice could be the media and how they adhere to the standards of how you report a suicide. It could be the safe storage of firearms and ammunition. What are the practices that are being supported by the community or by a tribal council, for example? And then there's also there's a lot of research looking at the use of public spaces and how those are kept related to parks. Take a look at the literature search and look in that section under public policies, and you'll see some really interesting ones there. All right, I'm going to pop over now to the protective factors. And here, the first one is feeling valued and mattering to others. And this is this perception of feeling that you are respected, that you are trusted, that you are significant to others. It is a concept that it's a young person's belief that they are also able to help others, that they are able to make a difference, that they can matter if they do something. Lots of times young people feel like, I can't do anything, nothing matters what I do. This concept of being valued is very much tied into a cultural context of what are the roles and responsibilities of individuals. The second one relates to social emotional competence and regulation skills. This one in particular is very powerful for young people who have experienced trauma. And it's generally those who have experienced early trauma do not have these skills, and anything and all we can do to help build this is important. But what do we mean by social emotional competence? We're talking about the skills where I am aware of my emotions and I know how to manage them. I know how to cope with them. I know how to cope with stress. I have my own stress management strategies. I can calm myself down. And these are also the same set of skills that help us make good decisions, be able to problem solve, but you can't do any of that until you can kind of calm down and be able to deal with those impulses. The next one is cultural identity and connection. And in this case, it's the same definition of what do we mean by cultural identity. Yet it is the extent to which someone connects to the values and beliefs of their culture and the practices and traditions. So culture is everything that is related to our way of living. It includes values, beliefs, traditions, protocols, rituals, language, behavior norms, ways of knowing, and styles of communication. The next is connected to family. We know this. It's that perception that a young person feels of being close and supported, understood, and loved. And it's certainly associated with positive parenting practices like clear family rules, consistent discipline practices, high expectations for education, age-appropriate supervision, and being present at key times during the day. The positive school climate is a student's feelings about their school, that it is a caring and a supportive and encouraging environment. Students get bonded to their school and feel connected to it based on their feelings about the people, not only their teachers, but the principal, the other staff, as well as their peers. The other one, one of our final ones is supported, trusted adults in addition to parents. And this becomes so important as young people age into adolescence. They need to have other people there that they can turn to for support. And this can be everything from teachers, neighbors, coaches. It could be youth group advisors. It could be mentors. If a healthcare provider is nearby and they can access them, it could certainly be one of them. It could be the school nurse, school counselor, anyone that they can access, that they can go to if they have a challenge. This has the supportive trusted adults is a theme that you'll see throughout all of these. Okay, and the last one is involved in quality after school programs and activities. Here we're talking about structured activities and programs that are supervised by a responsible trained adult who can provide age-appropriate guidance and autonomy. Big words, but my goodness, you can't have somebody who is treating all of the teenagers like they're 5-year-olds. It's really frustrating, and you're going to lose students if you do that. Quality programs, whether they are before school, after school, at camps, on the weekends, they involve these things. Many of these same protective factors, but they are supportive staff, friendly, respectful climate, intentional skill instruction, and what we call youth-centered practices. We'll go into that more on Thursday. But now I just want to point out, you see the little star by feeling valued and mattering to others. There's no way you don't teach that. It's built and it's nurtured through all these other protective factors. And what we found in our Alaska data is that it's extremely powerful. Let's look at what the research shows. But before we do that, I want to see if there's any questions about those definitions. Okay, since I'm not hearing Kayla, I'm going to figure we're okay, and I'm going to go on to what the research is. Oh.
Yes, no questions.
Okay, all right. So I put this young woman there as our reminder that we're looking at not just what we want to prevent these problems, but what we want to promote. Okay, so what does the research show us related to what we want to prevent? Here are the behaviors we want to prevent. Here are the protective factors. Here's which sector they are in. And you can see each check mark shows you what the national research demonstrated. Okay. Any questions about this? What I'm going to shift to while I'm waiting to see if there are any questions is what do we know about Alaska? This is the national research, but are our Alaska populations any different? So I'll go ahead then. So what's the relevance? You'll see those are the protective factors. And here are the youth risk behavior survey questions that correspond to each one of them. The first one, feeling like I matter to people in my community. It was an agree to disagree options. Able to control my emotions when I need to, and able to remain calm is a proxy for some of those social emotional competence skills connected to family. We could not ask the kind of question that might really get at that. So this is another proxy. I have a parent who talks with me about school almost every day. And you can see the rest of these here. Feeling, I have teachers who care about me. I feel comfortable getting help from 3 or more adults, and then taking part in organized after school activities 2 or more times weekly. These are indicators. So let's see what we found out. Well, Charles Udamal used to be the data analyst for the Division of Public Health, and he used to analyze and do the youth risk behavior survey analysis, as well as the behavioral, the BRFSS one too. In any case, he's now retired, and the two of us have been working together quite a bit, and he analyzed the 7 protective factors I just showed you with the almost 70 problem behaviors that are measured on YRBS. Remember, I showed you that whole list. And here are the 3 takeaways. This wouldn't surprise you. This is our data now. Protective factors correlated with a lower prevalence or percentage on most behaviors, not all of them, but most. There's an additive effect. That's a really important point. More protective factors reduce the problem behaviors. And this last one is, while you'll see a reduction, and you're going to see this in a moment, with the presence of one protective factor, it is the combination of these across the settings is where the greatest prevalence, the lower prevalence is, the less percentage. So let's see what we mean by this. Here are some protective factors. I'm sorry, we're looking at protective factors in mental health. Here's the youth risk behavior survey. We're looking at these two questions on the YRBS. They're mental health indicators. Feeling sad and hopeless, and that's answered by its students who say in the past year they felt sad or hopeless almost every day for 2 or more weeks in a row, which is essentially a definition of depression, such that they stop doing some of their usual activities. And the other one is seriously considering suicide. So I'm going to take this slow for those of you who are not as familiar with looking at data. So here's, first of all, I'm going to show you a chart and a pie chart here. So the percent or the prevalence of traditional high school students in 2019 who reported that they felt sad and hopeless. 38% of students reported that from traditional schools. Now we're going to compare that percentage with those who reported that they had protective factors or didn't. So 38%, here's the number, 38% here in this bar chart, the overall prevalence. What happens when they report that they do not have people who matter to them? And you'll see in the brown bar, that is the percent, little over 50. But if they report that they have people if they report that they feel like they matter to people, you can see what that number gets down to. Visually, if you compare the brown bar, which is they don't have that protective factor, and the green is that they do have the protective factor. So I'm now going to actually show you the data with the bigger picture here. 38% is the overall prevalence, mattering to people. If I don't matter to people, if I report that as a student, that number of feeling sad and hopeless goes up to 51. But if I report that I do have people, if I feel like I do matter to people, that goes down to 24. You can see I'm kind of stumbling because I'm thinking of the supportive adults a lot. And you'll see what this number is here, 50% to 25. It's a very similar number. I'll let you just look at that a moment. And again, each of these shows you the percentage without the protective factor and with the protective factor. So open this up for questions.
I'm not seeing
Did
any
you
yet.
do additional did you do any additional correlational analysis to look at the strongest protective factors overall as a combination?
Well, when we looked overall, well, the answer is yes and. Yes, we looked to see which ones had the most impact overall, and yet one of the things I've learned in this prevention field is that, you know, there's no one perfect shoe that fits everybody. It all depends on who we are and what our needs are. And it's also this combination here. Now, this is pretty typical. What you're seeing before you, and I'm going to show you a couple of other slides, and then we can go back to that question some more. Would that be okay?
Absolutely.
Sure. Okay. So we're going to now look at considering suicide. Here's the percentage, 25%. And then when we look at overall, we're looking at the chart. Okay, here this is. If they feel like they matter to people, it's 25%. If they feel like they don't, it's 35%. Teachers who care, 33%. If you don't have that protective factor, 19%. Everything that you're seeing, I can tell you that among alternative students, for example, the percentage of students who have seriously considered suicide is 40% versus 25%. And that's also, let me see, the number for alternative students is 60% of feeling sad and hopeless. Quite a bit different, quite a bit higher. You will see some similarity, but also a few differences. And that's the kind of thing that, you know, I could take offline with people because it gets pretty detailed. But here's where I want to go with this next point is, let's just take considering suicide for a moment. And we're going to look at what happens when you have, and again, our number was 25% for traditional high school students. If you don't have many protective factors, that number goes up to 40%, 41. If you do have 5 or more protective factors, the ones at least that we can measure, oops, that drops down to 10% or almost 11. So more is better, as we say, more matters. More protective factors matter. So I'll now stop and see if this might answer some or if you have some other questions that this might generate. Some things I can tell you is that we have looked at some subpopulations, and in general, with the exception of alternative high school students, I'll go back to this slide. These protective factors and their influence is pretty similar. Yet there are sometimes some differences that we'll see, particularly in rural Alaska. There may be some things that are more important. The other thing is this organized activities. We've got a lot of things going on when we're talking about high school students, because it may be that they don't have time and they don't have access. One, they may not have time because they have other responsibilities related to their families. And they may have financial responsibilities. And in addition, as I said, they may not have access. What we have found that these organized activities are particularly important for middle school students. And we don't have we don't have YRBS data for middle school students. So I'm going to shift over now if there aren't any other questions. And Kayla, there aren't any in the chat or anything?
Nope, none in the chat.
Okay, so we're going to switch over to this concept of what about the most vulnerable populations? And this was particularly important as I'm speaking with groups as yourselves, representing the Children's Trust, who has a primary concern about children who've experienced abuse. Well, the Administration for Children and Families, and that's this ACYF, they had done a literature review of the factors that are most important for these groups, those that are homeless, that are in foster care, that witness family violence, experience child abuse, or pregnant and parenting. And what I was relieved is one way to put it, but also happy to see that their protective factors they identified align with ours. The only thing that was particularly different was that there needed to be greater economic supports. And I couldn't agree more. We, again, selected the priority factors selected. You've got the whole list in your handout. You'll see poverty there. We had to pick the ones that we felt a community could do the most about. If you have an interest, and so again, that arrow is just reminding us that this is the context that these young people are facing as they are getting into adolescence and dealing with the peer pressures that get into these problems and having to navigate challenges. So if this is of interest to you and you want to read about this body of work, you'll see this link here. So there were a couple of quotes that I came across in the beginning or sort of in the middle of my career that changed my life. And I'd like to share those with you. And it's why I made a shift that I did. One national study, and this came from the National Longitudinal study of adolescent health. It was done by the Academy of Pediatrics. This is a quote from them, that the presence of 3 protective factors reduce the risk of suicide by 70 to 85%, regardless of gender and racial ethnic groups, including those with and without identified risk factors. So that got me to think about, I need to look even more at protective factors than I had been before. I was primarily working in adolescent health, and I was shifting over to behavioral health in those days. And then this other study is from the National American Indian Adolescent Health Survey, and they found that increasing the number of protective factors was more effective at reducing the probability of suicide than decreasing risk factors. And since I've worked in public health, I know you can't not address risk factors. We absolutely have to. Yet after they've happened, after a child has, if they have experienced some adversity or abuse, what can we do about it? And that's where this role of protective factors becomes so, so important, and why I've dedicated the rest of my career and my volunteer time to that. So it's also the reason why I shifting to, when we do part 2 of this workshop, we will look at what can we do to increase protective factors and specific protective factors. So I am kind of ending this session now so that I make sure that we've got enough time for some questions in here. And it can be any kind of far reaching. But I've got, I think there's a couple of polls there that you have for us. And can you bring those down for us?
Yep, I'll get that up.
And as you do that, I'm just leaving this slide up for you, which is a reminder of these are the priority risk and protective factors that came from Alaska. And when it comes to protective factors, I'm curious, which ones do you think are most important? If you're like me, you're going, well, it depends. And can I say all of them? But I wanted to get just a read or a beat on this from you all. If you had to pick one. So I'm wondering, among those there, would anyone want to speak to why do you think, why for either of those? Well,
I can share.
Oh, good.
Hi, my name is Rachel.
Rachel.
I chose the feeling valued and mattering to others because I feel like even if you're lacking several of the other identified protective factors, feeling valued and mattering to others kind of not replaces, but I feel like you're able to still kind of build and grow within those other protective factors. You know, so to me, it's sort of like at the very top of the list and being able to deal with other issues in your life in a more positive way.
Thank you. And you know, you're right. I think both of those are examples of if the other factors are present, those are what emerge. You cannot feel valued or feel like you matter if you don't have relationships at one level or another. And the same with your sense of identity is all about, and connection is about people. And a school and supportive adults and family and after school programs, all of those kinds of things can help nurture both that feeling and sense of value, mattering, and cultural identity. So good point. I think we've got another poll question there, right? What have we got? Yeah. This is the one about which one do you think you have the most influence on in your roles? In your role. Huh.
Hi, can I just do a comment while they're doing that?
Yeah, yeah.
So
Please do.
I would like to agree with the previous speaker that feeling valued and feeling like you matter to others, even if you're involved in a lot of things, you have sort of a nice family and all that other stuff. If somehow it is not making you feel valued and that you matter, it could be just sort of, I don't know, I want to say lackadaisical other programs that are, you're having sort of a, I don't know, maybe superficial experience in those other areas, that if it doesn't get to having you feel valued and matter to others, then it's not doing its job. And the other ones, could be, sketchy, but if somehow you feel like you matter to other people, then you're golden.
It gets at that sense of self-efficacy, right? That sense of self-confidence and a positive identity. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well said. Yeah, I got tears in my eyes. I don't know if you could see that. All right. Are there any key takeaways? I think we're done with the poll there. Thanks. That stood
Naomi,
out. Oh, we
Naomi
got someone else. Go
in
ahead.
the chat, Naomi said, I chose cultural identity because it encompasses feeling valued and mattered, as well as opens up a child to many people to connect to and learn from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. True. True. All right. In our last bits of time here, let's see. If you you can do this in the chat box, and you can just do this. It's open for anyone. If there are any key takeaways that you got from today, anything that particularly stood out for you, what was the most important that you got out of today? That'll help me think about for the next time. And I'll open up my chat box so I can get to see some of this too. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Actually, Kayla said, and what would you like to learn more about? And please, that would be super helpful to know what else you'd like to know. I will just switch to this next slide while you're writing, or at least I think I will. Oh, here's some resources that are going to be, they're available to you. As I mentioned to you, that they're on the Children's Trust website. It's the literature review I talked about. There's one related to the data analysis that Charles had done. And then there's one called More Matters, strategies to increase protective factors. And that's what I'm really going to be talking about more next Thursday. And just as a visual for you, part 2 is all moving to action. So I guess in we're right at 1 o'clock. So I guess I think we should probably end here in just a moment. Feel free to type in any of your other thoughts, any of your takeaways, anything else you'd like to see. Otherwise, I hope I'll get to see you at 6 o'clock on Thursday, and it will be recorded as well. Thanks, everyone.
Becky, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.